I found out my marriage was probably over because a strange man called me at 6:14 on a Wednesday morning and thanked me for being so understanding about the schedule. I had just poured coffee. The house was quiet, and my wife Amanda was upstairs in the shower getting ready for work when my phone lit up with an unknown number. I answered half asleep, expecting some client or wrong number, and this polished, confident voice said, "Hey man, I just wanted to make sure tonight still works because she told me you finally stopped asking questions, and honestly, I respect that." For a second, I thought I had misheard him, and I remember gripping the kitchen counter so hard my knuckles went white while I said, "I think you have the wrong number, because I have absolutely no idea who you are or why you're talking about my wife like that." There was this long, ugly silence. Then he hung up so fast it felt like even he realized he had just detonated something. I stood there staring at my phone with that cold, hollow feeling spreading through my chest, the kind that arrives before your mind can even catch up. Amanda came downstairs 10 minutes later dressed like nothing in the world was wrong, kissed my cheek, wrinkled her nose at my coffee, and gave me that bright fake smile I would later realize she had probably been practicing on me for months. We had been married 9 years, together for 12, and until recently I would have called us solid in that tired adult way people call things solid when they mean familiar, busy, and not actively on fire. The first signs of trouble had been small enough to explain away, which now makes me feel stupid in a way that still burns. She started sleeping with her phone under her pillow, started correcting me in this sharp, almost contemptuous tone whenever I asked innocent questions, started acting like every normal concern I had was some personal attack on her freedom. If I asked why she was suddenly going to late team dinners twice a week, she would laugh and say, "Michael, not everybody wants to live the tiny little life you're comfortable with." If I noticed she had changed her passcode after years of not caring, she would roll her eyes and say, "You always make everything weird." It was like being slowly trained to distrust my own instincts. She became colder, meaner, and weirdly theatrical, like every conversation needed to end with me apologizing for noticing what was right in front of me. That morning, after the phone call, I tried to act normal, but then another unexpected thing happened that made my stomach drop straight through the floor. Amanda left for work in a rush and forgot her tablet on the dining room chair. She never forgot anything, and when the screen lit up, I saw a preview from a contact saved under a woman's name that read, "Last night was worth every lie." I actually sat down because my legs felt weak. I told myself there had to be an explanation, that maybe I was about to become one of those paranoid husbands I used to pity. But deep down, I already knew the truth had entered the room and was not leaving. I picked up the tablet with shaking hands, hearing the garage door close, realizing I had just crossed from suspicion into discovery, and whatever I found next was going to cost me the life I thought I had. I remember staring at that tablet like it was some kind of explosive device, because the message preview alone had already done enough damage to make my hands shake, and yet part of me still hoped opening it would somehow prove I was wrong. I told myself there had to be some innocent explanation, maybe sarcasm between coworkers or some strange joke that looked worse than it was. But the moment the screen unlocked, the illusion collapsed so fast it almost made me dizzy. The conversation thread was long, dense, and painfully casual in the way people sound when they have been lying comfortably for a long time. Whoever this person was, they were not new to my wife's life, and they definitely were not just a coworker grabbing drinks after a late meeting. One message in particular felt like someone pressing a thumb into an open wound. It read, "You said your husband finally stopped being suspicious, so tonight should be easier." I remember whispering out loud to an empty kitchen, "I never stopped being suspicious, Amanda. I just trusted you enough to stop asking." What made it worse was the contact name. It was saved as Rachel Work, which meant the person texting her was clearly not Rachel, and the deception felt almost theatrical in its laziness, like she had stopped believing I was even capable of noticing anything. As I scrolled, more lies revealed themselves piece by piece, and each one felt heavier than the last. They talked about hotel rooms that had supposedly been work trips. They joked about me believing she was visiting her sister, and there were entire conversations about how exhausting it was for her to manage my feelings. I sat there rereading that phrase because it stung in a way I could not immediately explain. Managing my feelings. Like I was some inconvenient responsibility instead of the man who had built a life with her for more than a decade. Then the morning took another turn that I still struggled to explain without feeling a strange mixture of rage and disbelief. While I was reading those messages, another notification appeared on the screen, and it was from someone I recognized immediately. The name that popped up was Daniel, my closest friend since college, a man who had stood next to me as my best man on my wedding day. The message said, "Careful. He almost asked me yesterday if something was going on. I covered for you, but he is starting to notice things." I remember feeling this strange ringing in my ears, as if my body could not process the information fast enough. I actually laughed out loud in that hollow way people do when reality suddenly feels absurd. The betrayal I had been bracing myself for had just doubled in size, and suddenly the problem was not just that my wife had been lying to me for months. The problem was that someone I trusted like a brother had apparently been helping her do it. And in that moment, sitting alone at my dining table with the tablet glowing in my hands, I realized the ground beneath my life was already collapsing long before I even knew there were cracks. I wish I could say I closed the tablet and waited calmly for Amanda to come home so we could have a mature conversation like the kind you see in movies where people sit across from each other and speak honestly about broken trust. But the truth is, I spent the entire day unraveling in slow motion. I kept rereading the messages, hoping that somewhere in that endless thread I would find a line that proved I had misunderstood everything. Yet every new scroll only added another layer of deception. There were weeks of conversations, carefully coordinated lies, and jokes about how predictable I was. At one point she had written, "If he asks, just repeat what we said last time about the late meeting, because Michael always backs down when I make him feel paranoid." I remember whispering to the empty room, "Amanda, I backed down because I loved you, not because I was blind." By the afternoon, I made a decision that felt both desperate and inevitable. I called Daniel. My voice sounded strange, even to me, like it belonged to someone else who had stepped into my life without permission. When he answered, he sounded cheerful in that easy way he always had, and for a few seconds I almost wanted to pretend nothing was wrong just to hold on to the illusion a little longer. Instead, I told him, slowly and carefully, "Daniel, I need you to be honest with me right now, because I just read a message where you said you covered for Amanda, and I need you to explain exactly what that means." The silence on the other end of the phone stretched so long that I could hear his breathing change. Then he spoke in this cautious voice that made my stomach tighten. "Michael, listen, you are misunderstanding things, and I promise you this looks worse than it really is." I remember gripping the edge of the kitchen table and saying, "Then make it look better, because right now it looks like my best friend has been helping my wife lie to me." What happened next was the first moment I truly felt something inside me fracture. Daniel did not deny it. Instead, he sighed like a tired man carrying a burden and said something that felt almost surreal. "Amanda asked me to keep you calm because she said you would overreact if you knew what was going on." The casual way he said it made the betrayal feel even colder. I asked him the question that had been burning in my chest all day, and my voice came out low and unsteady. "Daniel, who is the man she is seeing?" There was another pause, longer this time, and when he finally answered, his words changed the entire situation again. "Michael, I thought you already knew it was someone from your office." For a moment, I could not even process what he had said. I remember staring at the wall as the realization crept slowly into focus. Amanda had always claimed she never interacted with my coworkers, that my job bored her, and that she had no reason to meet anyone there. Yet according to Daniel, the man she had been secretly meeting for months was someone who worked in the same building as me. And as that truth settled in, a terrible new thought began forming in the back of my mind, because suddenly the late nights, the unexplained errands, And the strange tension at work started aligning into a pattern I had completely failed to see before. What I did not know yet was that the next discovery would make Daniel's betrayal look almost small by comparison. By the time evening came, my head felt like it was full of broken glass. I had spent hours staring at the same messages, replaying conversations from the past few months, trying to stitch together a timeline of lies that had apparently been unfolding right in front of me. When Amanda finally walked through the front door that night, she tossed her purse on the chair and greeted me with that same bright, rehearsed smile she had given me that morning. I remember thinking how strange it was that someone could walk into a room carrying so many secrets and still look completely relaxed. She started talking about her day in that casual tone she always used when she wanted to sound normal, but I interrupted her before she could finish the story. I looked straight at her and said slowly, "Amanda, before you tell me anything else, I want you to explain why your tablet has months of messages with a man you saved under the name Rachel." The expression on her face changed in a way that felt almost theatrical. First surprise, then irritation, and finally something colder. Instead of panicking, she crossed her arms and sighed like I had just inconvenienced her with a ridiculous accusation. She said, with a sharp laugh that made my stomach twist, "Michael, this is exactly why I didn't want you snooping through my things, because you always jump to the worst possible conclusions." I held the tablet up and replied, "Amanda, the worst possible conclusion would be me believing that a message saying, 'Last night was worth every lie,' is about a group project." For a moment she said nothing. Then she rolled her eyes and launched into a speech that sounded rehearsed, claiming the messages were just emotional support from a coworker who was going through a divorce, and that the flirting was meaningless. She spoke quickly, confidently, and with that same dismissive tone she used whenever she wanted to make me feel small. But then I mentioned Daniel. The shift in the room was immediate. Her confidence cracked for just a second, and in that tiny pause I saw the truth flash across her face before she could hide it. I told her exactly what he had said, word for word, and suddenly the conversation stopped being a performance. Her voice hardened as she snapped, "Of course Daniel tried to make it sound worse, because he has always liked drama." I stared at her in disbelief and said, "Amanda, he literally admitted helping you lie to me." She paced across the kitchen and started blaming everyone except herself, accusing Daniel of exaggerating, accusing me of invading her privacy, accusing me of being emotionally exhausting to live with. The entire conversation felt like standing inside a storm of excuses. Then she made a mistake. In the middle of her rant, she said something that froze the air in the room. She snapped, "And if you had paid more attention to your own office, maybe you would have noticed what was happening months ago." I remember narrowing my eyes and asking quietly, "What exactly was happening in my office, Amanda?" She realized too late what she had revealed. Because in that moment it became clear that this was not just some random man she had met recently. Whoever she was seeing had been around long enough to know my job, my schedule, and probably even my coworkers. And suddenly, the betrayal wasn't just inside my home anymore. It had been following me to work the entire time. The silence after that sentence felt heavy enough to crush the room. Amanda froze for a moment like someone who had stepped too far onto thin ice, and I could see her mind scrambling to repair the damage. I leaned forward slowly and said in a voice that barely sounded like my own, "Amanda, you just told me the man you've been lying to me about knows my office, so I'm going to ask you one time, calmly and clearly. Who is he?" For the first time that entire night, she didn't immediately respond with sarcasm or deflection. Instead, she looked away and rubbed her forehead like the conversation had suddenly become exhausting for her. Then she muttered something that made my stomach drop even lower. She said, "You're blowing this completely out of proportion, Michael. It's not even someone important." That sentence alone felt like an insult layered on top of betrayal. Not someone important. As if the destruction of our marriage could be categorized like a minor scheduling conflict. I told her I already knew about the messages. I knew about Daniel helping her cover things up, and I knew the man worked somewhere around me. so the only thing left was for her to finally tell the truth. She paced across the kitchen again, her voice growing sharper with every word, accusing me of interrogating her like a criminal and saying that my constant suspicion was exactly why she felt emotionally distant in the first place. Listening to her rewrite the story in real time made my chest tighten with a mixture of anger and disbelief. The entire conversation had become a performance where she tried to convince me that my reaction to betrayal was somehow the real problem. Then another unexpected piece of the puzzle fell into place. My phone buzzed on the counter with a message from work. Normally, I would have ignored it during something like this, but the timing was strange enough that I glanced down at the screen. It was from my coworker Jason, a guy from accounting who rarely texted outside office hours. The message read, "Hey man, weird question, but did Amanda come by the office again today? She stopped by last week asking for someone while you were in a meeting." I remember reading that sentence 3 times before looking back up at my wife. Slowly, carefully, I asked, "Amanda, when exactly did you start visiting my office?" Her face changed again, this time in a way that looked almost like panic. She opened her mouth to answer, but stopped halfway through the sentence, and that hesitation told me more than anything she could have said. I held up my phone and repeated Jason's message out loud. The color drained from her face as she realized the lies were no longer lining up the way she had planned. And then she finally said the name. But when the name left her mouth, the entire situation twisted into something even worse than I had imagined. Because the man she admitted seeing was not just someone from my building. He was my manager. The same man who had been praising my work for months, inviting me to lunch, asking personal questions about my marriage like he was concerned about my well-being. The same man who had apparently been sitting across from me in meetings while secretly building a relationship with my wife behind my back. And in that moment I understood something terrifying. The betrayal had not just been emotional or personal. It had been happening right in front of me, in 2 different parts of my life, at the exact same time. When Amanda said his name, I felt something inside my chest collapse in a way that words barely capture. My manager, Richard Lawson, had been in my life for 3 years. He was the kind of man who built his reputation on calm authority and polite mentorship. He used to clap me on the shoulder during meetings and say things like, "Michael, you are one of the most reliable people on this team." And I believed him because he always sounded sincere. Hearing Amanda say his name that night felt like the floor had opened beneath everything I trusted. I stared at her and said slowly, almost mechanically, "Richard, my boss, the man who asks about our marriage every week. That is the person you chose to lie to me with." Amanda didn't answer immediately. Instead, she leaned against the counter with that irritated expression she always used when she believed I was being dramatic. Then she shrugged in a way that still burns when I think about it and said, "You're acting like this is some kind of conspiracy, Michael, when it was just something that happened." I remember laughing in disbelief because the scale of what she was minimizing felt almost surreal. "Something that happened?" I repeated. "Amanda, this man supervises me. He controls my projects, my evaluations, my entire career, and you're telling me this was just something that happened?" She rolled her eyes again and muttered that I was turning it into a bigger problem than it needed to be. But the night had not finished escalating yet. Because while we were arguing, my phone buzzed again with another message from Jason at the office. The second text was shorter but somehow far more unsettling. It read, "Actually, now that I think about it, Amanda didn't ask for you when she came by. She went straight to Lawson's office like she had been there before." I read that sentence out loud without even thinking, and the moment the words left my mouth, Amanda's expression changed in a way I had not seen before. Not irritation, not annoyance, fear. The pieces started locking together in my mind with terrifying clarity. Richard had been unusually interested in my personal life for months. He had asked casual questions about when Amanda worked late, when she traveled, when I planned to take time off. At the time, I had assumed he was just trying to be friendly, maybe even supportive. Now, every one of those conversations felt poisoned with a new meaning. I looked at Amanda and asked the question that suddenly mattered more than anything else. How long? My voice came out low and hollow. She hesitated again, which told me everything before she even spoke. Then she said quietly, "About 8 months. 8 months. 8 months of meetings where my boss shook my hand. 8 months of conversations where Amanda told me she was working late. 8 months where two people I trusted had been coordinating lies while I walked through my life believing everything was normal. I thought the worst part was hearing the truth. But the worst part came 30 seconds later when Amanda said something that completely changed the story again. She looked straight at me and said, "Michael, Richard wasn't even the one who started it." When Amanda said that Richard wasn't the one who started it, I felt that same cold sensation spreading through my chest again. The feeling that the story was still unfinished and somehow about to get worse. I stared at her for a long moment and said slowly, "Amanda, there is absolutely no version of this that gets better, so you might as well finish telling the truth." She looked down at the floor and exhaled like someone who had been carrying a secret for too long. The confidence she had shown earlier was gone now, replaced by something heavier. Then she said something that made the entire timeline in my head collapse. She said, "It actually started with Daniel." For a moment I thought I had misheard her. My mind simply refused to process the sentence. I took a step closer and said carefully, "Daniel, my best friend, the man who helped plan our wedding." "That Daniel?" She nodded slowly, avoiding my eyes. The kitchen suddenly felt too small, like the walls had moved closer together. I remembered the phone call earlier that day, the way he had tried to sound calm while explaining the messages, the way he said Amanda asked him to keep me calm. Now those words sounded completely different. Amanda began explaining in a quiet voice that Daniel had started visiting more often during the past year while I was busy at work. At first, it had just been long conversations, complaining about life, talking about how distant I had become, talking about how lonely she felt. She described it like some tragic emotional spiral where two people convinced themselves they were misunderstood by the same person. I stood there listening while a slow, heavy anger built in my chest. I interrupted her and said, "Amanda, you're describing betrayal like it was some kind of therapy session." She insisted it had never been serious, that it was brief, that it ended months ago, but the words sounded hollow. According to her, Daniel eventually panicked and pulled away because he realized how destructive it was becoming. That was when Richard entered the picture at my office. Amanda said Richard had approached her first when she came to pick me up one afternoon months ago, and that he had already known who she was. That detail stopped me cold. I asked her, "How did my boss know who you were before you even introduced yourself?" Amanda hesitated again, and that hesitation was becoming the most terrifying part of every answer she gave. Finally, she said quietly, "Because Daniel had already talked to him about you." The room went silent. My best friend had not only betrayed me personally, he had apparently told my boss enough about my marriage for the man to recognize my wife the moment she walked into the building. And suddenly, a darker possibility started forming in my mind, one that made the entire situation feel less like a series of bad decisions and more like something calculated. I looked at Amanda and asked one final question. "Did either of them ever talk about me together?" Her eyes widened slightly, and that reaction alone told me the truth before she even spoke. Amanda didn't answer my question right away, and that silence felt heavier than anything she had said all night. I watched her face carefully, because by that point I had learned something important about lies. People rarely confess with words first. They confess with hesitation. Her shoulders dropped slightly, and she looked away like someone who had run out of ways to rearrange the story. Finally, she spoke in a quiet voice that sounded nothing like the sharp, confident tone she had used earlier. "Yes, they talked about you." The room felt unnaturally still. I remember hearing the faint hum of the refrigerator and thinking how strange it was that ordinary sounds continued while my entire life seemed to be collapsing in slow motion. I asked her to explain, and she began describing something that felt far worse than simple betrayal. Daniel had complained about me to Richard months ago during a networking event. At the time, Daniel had been frustrated with his own life, and apparently talking about my marriage had somehow turned into a strange form of entertainment for them. He told Richard that I worked too much, that Amanda felt neglected, that our relationship was strained. Richard had laughed about it and said something like, "Men who are distracted at home usually don't notice what's happening around them." When Amanda first met Richard at my office, he already knew pieces of our life. He knew my schedule. He knew when I stayed late. He knew the exact shape of the distance in my marriage. That knowledge made everything easier for him. Amanda admitted that at first she had been uncomfortable with how much he already seemed to know about us. But Richard had framed everything like he was the one person who truly understood how lonely she felt. He used the exact same frustrations Daniel had described, the same complaints, the same vulnerabilities. I remember staring at her and asking one final question, even though I already suspected the answer. Did Daniel know about Richard? Amanda nodded slowly. That was the moment the final piece of the story locked into place. Daniel had not simply made a terrible mistake and backed away. He had been involved from the beginning, had complained about my marriage to my boss, and when things spiraled further, he helped Amanda hide it from me while pretending to be my closest friend. The two men who had shaken my hand, shared meals with me, and listened to me talk about my life, had quietly turned that trust into an opportunity. Strangely, that realization brought a kind of clarity I had not felt all day. The anger was still there, but it was no longer chaotic. It became sharp and focused. I looked at Amanda and said something that felt like closing a door inside my chest. "Amanda, I spent years believing our marriage was a partnership built on honesty. But tonight I learned that the two people closest to me were discussing my life like it was a problem to be solved without me in the room." She tried to say something then, some tired explanation about confusion and mistakes and emotional distance. But by that point, the words felt empty. The damage had already expanded beyond repair. Within 2 months, I filed for divorce. I left that job soon after and cut Daniel completely out of my life. The strange part is that losing them all at once hurt deeply, but it also forced me to rebuild my life on something more solid than blind trust. I learned that silence in a relationship can be just as destructive as betrayal, because unanswered questions slowly become secrets. I learned that some people hide their intentions behind concern, kindness, and familiarity. If anyone reading this finds themselves in a situation where their instincts keep whispering that something is wrong, my advice is simple. Do not ignore that voice just because you want peace. Pay attention to the small changes, the quiet inconsistencies, the moments that feel slightly out of place. Because sometimes the worst betrayal is not the moment you discover the truth. Sometimes it is realizing how many people already knew it before you did.